It's the Tip of the Spear podcast. Cuts right through the noise and hits in the heart of the matter. Now here's your host, Justin Spears.
That's right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Tip of the Spear podcast, where we cut through all the flotsam and jetsam, get right to the heart of the matter, drowning out all the noise, the dribble, the drag, and the nonsense that you'll hear in the mainstream media. It's good to be with you again. I hope you all had a great week. We're back for episode 3 now. We're working through the first couple of shows. We're starting to get the format down a little bit. Still got a lot to work on. Still got some things to improve on. But nonetheless, we persevere moving forward. And so again, I'd like to welcome all of our first-time listeners out there. Welcome everybody back who's been with me. Just a couple of things before we get into our show content today. Some ways that you can listen to the show and follow along with what I have going on. The show is broadcast on the Cerberus Radio Network on Monday afternoons at 5 p.m. on Radio Co. So if you go to radio.co and go to the Cerberus Radio Network, you can listen to the show run at 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. Obviously, as we get the first couple of shows under our belt, we'll cycle through older shows so you can catch them. But right now, we're just kind of moving back and forth between the first couple that we've produced. But you can definitely find the show there. You can access all of the older episodes through there. As I said, we will circle those through there. You will also be able to find shows on my Facebook page and my Twitter feed. So I am active on Facebook and Twitter. You can find me by going to facebook.com/Justin Spears 4, the number 4. Also on Twitter at Justin Spears 4. I do have a place where I hold the podcast as well called Spreaker. So if you go to Spreaker.com and search for The Other Side with Margison and Spears, the show is actually housed in with my older show that I used to be a part of called The Other Side. You can catch all of that old content plus the new stuff that I'm putting out now. I'm also writing for FEED, the Foundation for Economic Education. I have 3 or 4 articles that I've had published through them that you can catch and read there. If you go to feed.org/people, you will be able to find my profile on there, and you'll be able to see all kinds of information about me, what interests me, what I read, why I got into writing, and things of that nature. So that's FEED, the Foundation for Economic Education. Fee.org. I've also written over at the 10th Amendment Center. Shout out to Mike Meharry, Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center. Those guys are doing some great work. You can visit them at 10thamendmentcenter.com, and you will be able to find all kinds of information related to things related to freedom and liberty. What the 10th Amendment stands for is returning power back to the people and removing it away from Washington, D.C., which we know is a challenge. So I appreciate the work that those guys are doing over there and the platform that they've given me to be able to write. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of different places where you can reach my content. I'm also in the mix of writing a book right now. I'm getting hopefully very, very close to having a first edit done. We're putting the finishing touches on that. That's a book that's being co-written by my colleague, Mike Margison, who you've heard on The Other Side with me before. He is also a teacher with myself, and we've worked together now for coming up on 5 years. And so late last year, we decided to take on the endeavor of writing a book. That book is going to be entitled Failure: The History and Results of a Broken School System. So you can look forward to that coming out. Hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have to see how the editing process and publishing process goes. But that's kind of the track that we're on there timeline-wise. So as I said, a lot going on. If you were with us last week on our show, we covered a number of different topics. This week's going to be no different. I have a couple of main points that we're going to go through here together today. I kind of want to go through something that I was able to experience this past week and tie that on into a piece that I'm working on right now. As a matter of fact, I just submitted for publication. I hope to have that out and published here relatively soon on education, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I do want to wrap up the show today by talking about the current situation in Hong Kong. And I came across a piece written by opinion piece written by Newt Gingrich over at Fox News this week that I really want to break down and kind of deconstruct a little bit. So as I said, in these episodes, what we're trying to do is move past the regular narrative of what you'll hear either in the mainstream media or just, kind of common sense issues, right? And typically the standard line of thinking on things, and start to break them down and think about them. As I've mentioned before, one of the things that I try to do as a classroom teacher with my students is reinforce the power of dialectical thinking, of kind of going back through and thinking about what we know and why we know it, reasoning and rationalizing our way through why we stand where we stand on things. I think far too often today, that's a process that doesn't happen. We live in echo chambers. We live in the world of social media where everybody's an expert on everything. And so therefore, oftentimes we end up coming around to conclusions and have opinions on things, and we really don't understand or truly know why that is. And that's because oftentimes we don't think about these things. We just accept things that we hear and read and build opinions out and continue to repeat those. So, keeping that in mind, we want to go ahead and jump into content today. And I want to start off with an experience that I had this week. I was very, very fortunate and honored to be able to speak in a local organization. I live in the Indianapolis area. I live just about 25 minutes west of Indianapolis, but I had the opportunity this week to go down to the east side of Indianapolis and speak to the Sertoma Club of the east side of Indianapolis. And Sertoma is short for Service to Mankind. And there are chapters and organizations. I know here in the Indianapolis area, I believe the gentleman told me there are 4 or 5 different clubs sprinkled throughout the city, different parts of the city. Each chapter, it can vary in size. The one club that I spoke with on the east side of Indianapolis, I think they said their membership's at around about 35 to 40 people. So you're going to see a lot of different activities, obviously with the acronym or the moniker Service to Mankind. They're going to be engaged and involved in a lot of what's going on in society and what's going on in different cities that they're a part of. And I was able to kind of, be an observer and listen to just some of the great things that they're doing, some of the great work that they're involved with. They're really trying to make a big impact in the community. And that's one of the things that we argue all the time in our shows is we've got to get moving away from looking for government to solutions on things and looking at organizations like Sertoma Club. And there are many, many others that are out there that are trying to do great work in different communities to help move the needle on advancing progress and positive progress in cities. When we look at what's going on today with poverty and crime and everything, it can be very disheartening when you read stories in the news and you see relations with law enforcement, and it just seems like things are kind of crumbling apart from time to time. So it is nice to be reinforced and know that there are organizations like Sertoma out there. And again, shout out to Aaron Koenig, who was the one that reached out to me. He heard me on a local radio show that I was on over the summer. He really liked the message that I brought. He thought it was something, a little bit of a unique perspective. And so what that was me going in and talking to them about my perspectives on education, being a public school teacher. And those of you that have followed me, that have listened to me on various shows, read stuff that I've written, you kind of know where I stand on this, right? And it was one of the things that I mentioned and talked about in my address to them as I kind of talked about the ideas of breaking down the public school system. And I want to be very clear every time I say this, and Mike, my colleague, and I have both said this, we're not calling for taking a wrecking ball to public schools, a literal wrecking ball, and knocking them down and leaving them, no choice to go to a public school. If people in society, in our country, want to have their children attend public school, more power to them. That's absolutely should be their choice. If they like what their local school has to offer, fantastic. They can, certainly continue to pursue that. What we are arguing is because of the compulsive nature, and more specifically, the foundation of that compulsive nature of schooling, that we talk about in our upcoming book, that is the coercive nature that leaves so many people handcuffed. because there is a monopoly of on schooling in the United States through government-run schools. And now I know people will say, but what about charters? What about private school? What about these other options? Yes, it is true. Those are increasing in options or in selectivity, but still, comparative to the numbers, the percentages, an overwhelming percentage of students and children in this country are going to attend public schools. And a lot of that has to do with how difficult it is for a family to be able to opt into an alternative. Laws have been established both at the federal and state level that depending on where you live, it can be extremely difficult to be able to get your child into the school of your choice. And if your public school is letting you down or you feel like it's failing your child, you absolutely have every right as the parent to be able to choose an option that would be better for your child or children. And that's really going to kind of be a little bit of the theme here with what I choose to focus on, because I walk them through a lot of different things related to how I've come to arrive at this conclusion now, spending over a decade in public schools. And one of the first things that I started with them on, because I think, again, not too many people think of it in these terms, is understanding the difference between schooling and education. We do not have a public education system, contrary to what you'll hear in the nomenclature of how people talk about education in America. We do not have a public education system. We have a public school system. And what I mean by that is there is a clear difference between education and schooling. And basically what I laid out to them was this. Look, schooling is all about conformity. It's all about getting kids in at an early age, and it seems like increasingly ever more early ages now with pre-K and early learning academies that are springing up all over the place. It's about getting kids in and conditioning them to rules. It's about conditioning them to how to play school, how to learn in schools, how to follow directions, how to be good boys and girls so that they can produce the numbers that schools want. Not necessarily because school or school administrators or teachers have a vested interest, contrary to what you'll hear, to your success. They simply want the number. They want this test score numbers. They want to show that kids are moving through the ranks in order without any setbacks and so on and so forth, because this is what affects funding. And so, again, proponents of public school system will tell you, it's all about a liberal arts education and being well-rounded and preparing students for, that final walk across the stage their senior year. But the reality of it is that the system doesn't care about any of that. First off, the system can't. It doesn't have the ability to. What I'm referring to when I say that is the majority of people that run the system don't care about those things. Now, again, you may come across people who give it lip service, and they may act and pretend like, we really have a vested interest in ensuring that these kids come out okay. But the results just show that that's simply not true. And that's, again, we're going to get into that here in a little bit more detail in just a moment. So that's schooling, right? That's schooling. You look at that in contrast to education, right? And I really love what John Taylor Gatto, and you've heard me mention Gatto before on a number of other occasions. I tell you, the more I read about Gatto and the more I read his stuff, you talk about living up to kind of the motto of this show, piercing right to the heart of the matter, that tip of the spear. He minces no words. As somebody who spent, I believe, almost 30 years in public school, he had seen it all. New York City, roughest of the rough, just unbelievable experience. He cuts right to the heart of the matter when detailing and chronicling the damage that schooling does. So one of the things that he says that I really like about education, he says, you can't give anybody an education. It has to be taken. And what I really like about that, the imagery that should invoke as you think about this is, it's the old adage about leading a horse to water, right? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And what's missing there about that is that force, right? That compulsive nature of forcing somebody to do something. And that's essentially what education, schooling, I should say, does. It tries to impose its will upon students to learn things in a certain sequence, at a certain time, and in a certain way, right? And that's all dictated and predicated based off of standards and teacher practices and things of that nature. And that's absolutely contrary to what would allow learning to blossom in an individual. And I always use this example of, thinking about how you learn, for example, to walk or talk or eat or play, cooperate with other humans. It's none of that's through force, right? It's all natural. It's all out of the curiosity and a very innate instinct to learn how to do certain things, right? No one from the government shows up at your house and tells you, okay, I'm here today to teach you how to crawl. I'm here today to teach you how to walk, right? It's something that, yes, there are guides in place that can help encourage and get progress in those things, but they all have to happen organically, and they all have to and they all happen at different times too. By the way, every individual person learns these things at different times, right? And the classic example where parents start to panic, when little Johnny isn't crawling yet, or isn't walking yet, or isn't starting to talk yet, and we kind of get nervous and we think, oh, there's a delay, or is there something wrong? And we just, now obviously at some point there can be, but we just have to be patient, right? Every person develops and learns at a different pace, but the one size fits all of school runs absolutely counter to that, right? It says if you're not reading at this level, some arbitrary score number that's assigned through taking a test, like here in the state of Indiana, we take a third graders take a test called iRead. And if you don't meet a certain score and you're not proficient, they threaten you with holding you back and having remedial reading classes and things like that. But there have been numbers of studies that have shown that there's absolutely no long-term effect to students or children who learn to read much later, whether it be, at fourth or fifth, grade age levels before they start to read or read for comprehension. And so again, it's the kind of the arbitrary forced nature of what's the signals that schooling sends that damages our children. And so I talked a lot about that. And then I went into explaining how I've noticed this. And again, I used Gatto's framework of what he writes in a book called Weapons of Mass Instruction, where in part of that book, he details and chronicles the things that school really teaches. And just as a quick example, I'm not going to go through all of them with you today, but he talks about, for example, emotional dependency, indifference, the fact that you can't hide. It teaches class position by labeling, and applying numbers. It creates, different groups in school, such as gifted and talented, normal, below average, and then obviously special needs, and so on and so forth. And that by creating all of these groups, it creates stigmas and things of that nature. So I basically laid all of these things out, and then I gave them real world examples, things that I've experienced, as to how I could, validate that. And this group was made up of mostly older people. I would say of the 30-ish or so people that were there, the average age in the room was probably somewhere, I would guess, between 65 and 68. Majority of these individuals were retired community leaders that were just, again, repaying and helping out in society. And I wasn't quite sure how it would be received, because sometimes people in those age groups can be very set in their ways, and, you're challenging a system that's, inherent in the American fabric and fiber. And the group was overwhelmingly what we would call conservative or Republican. As a matter of fact, I was talking with a couple of guys before my speech, and they were telling me, yeah, overwhelmingly the number of people here tend to lean more Republican, conservative. So to challenge a system like this, I wasn't quite sure how that would be received. But I was delighted and got a couple messages afterwards to say that the organization in whole really enjoyed the speech. It opened up a lot of thoughts and questions about the school system that we have here, especially here in Indiana. I talk mostly here locally to kind of relate to them about how different things are going on. And so one of the questions that came out of the speech that I wanted to focus on here for just a little bit was somebody had asked me in the question and answer section, well, what's an example of a school system that's getting it right? And I was trying to, use the kid gloves approach. I didn't want to come across as like, well, nobody is, because in some way, shape, or form, even when you look at the cream of the crop, right? Basically, and I said this, but I went ahead and said, well, schools like Carmel and Noblesville and, these areas around the suburbs of Indianapolis are doing pretty well. They're more affluent parts of the state. I said, obviously we see in the media, they're the ones that get the high I-STEP scores and whatnot. But I did say, but I want to caution in saying that, to me, all that means is that they've learned how to play the game, right? And that's really, how we have to look at this. And so many people get caught up in, ranking of schools. And certainly when people are looking at living in certain areas, they'll get, looking at schools and, oh, is this a good school system? Is it a bad school system? How close are alternatives and things of that nature? So, I cautioned and tempered that by saying, look, it's all well and fine to say these are the better performing schools, but really, what does that mean, right? It means that they've learned how to play the game. That doesn't mean that the things that I've just described to you aren't occurring in those schools, because I would bet the farm that if you were to walk into the best performing public school in the state of Indiana, you're going to find a number of kids that are bored out of their mind, that are just absolutely done with being at school, frustrated, angry, anxiety, you name it, right? These things are real things that do not get talked about in school. And so basically we came around to the follow-up question of, well, what about reform? And I said, well, that's an interesting thing, because I've actually read a book on the idea of reform. And I've mentioned this before on certain appearances that I've been on with Suzanne in the Wasatch Report or Waking Up Cerberus. I've written about it before as well, but I want to reference this again. And I would highly encourage anybody who has any kind of an interest in understanding what's going on with schools in America today to pick up a copy of Stephen Brill's Class Warfare: Inside the Fight to Fix America's Schools. I was gifted this book by somebody, and when I first got it, I thought, this is going to be a waste of time. I'm not going to want to read this thing. So it sat on my shelf for a while. And then as I got into writing my book, I started going back and looking at, okay, what educational resources do I have? And one of the things that Mike and I, my co-author and I, were talking about is, what do we oftentimes hear from those that are pro public school advocates, right? And one of the things that oftentimes we hear about, whether it's through union groups or, again, just teachers or what have you, is, progressive, right? The schools are, we're reforming schools, we're not perfect, but we're trying to get it right. And so this idea of reform. So I thought, okay, I'll give this a chance. And it's a fairly thick book. It's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about 450 pages or so, a lot of sources, but it's written almost like a journal, because what it does is this gentleman was inside, kind of had the inside scoop in working with the Obama administration. For those of you that aren't aware, President Obama, one of his capstone pieces while he was in office related to education was something called Race to the Top. And essentially what that was is it was a competition by the states to get additional funding for schools. And we're talking about big time money. And there were many, many states that participated in attempting to get their hands on some of these funds, because, again, the dollars were just simply too much to pass up. And so what he does is it's a fascinating account. I just found myself not able to put this down as I'm reading through. I'm writing questions, I'm making comments, because what I think, and I don't, by the way, I want to say, I don't think that Brill would agree with my synopsis on this. By the way, I think what he would say is the work that was done during this period of time was very noble. Now, I will give him credit. He calls a spade, and so if there were people inside the Democrat Party that were not doing what he thought needed to be done. He calls them out. It's definitely not a partisan attack on Republicans or anything like that. He's very critical of the unions in here as well, and their fight specifically in the state of New York against the rise of charter schools. So again, I want to make sure I give Stephen Brill credit. He will call a spade, but I think ultimately where we would kind of part ways is, and this is where I would want to go with here, is that the idea of reforming a school or a school district or the school system as a whole is a futile attempt. It will never work. And what is one of the things that we oftentimes hear from pro public school advocates is, we just need more money. If only we had more money. If only we had enough money. And it's a complete farce. There's never going to be enough money. It doesn't matter what you do. There's never going to be enough resources for these people to be satisfied. When you look at per pupil funding throughout the states and as the country as a whole, I don't remember the national average off the top of my head. I believe here in the state of Indiana, we're at about $13,000 per student to educate somebody in a year. And that, if I'm not mistaken, that's the average. So obviously that doesn't account for children that have been labeled special needs, which clearly probably require a little bit more resources and support. But you get the point, right? That's to me, that's a mind-numbing number, that you're making the case that it takes $13,000 to educate a human being. I would make the case that I could do that for much, much less. Now, again, public school advocates are going to say, yeah, but you don't have the constraints and so on and so forth, and you don't have 30 kids to have to try to do all at one time like they do in charters and other alternatives or homeschooling. And that's absolutely right. You're making my point for me. You're making a point that says this system needs to be broken down. You need to relieve the pressure because you're cramming so many kids into public education, you can't handle it. Right. But you're in this conundrum. You're in this quarrel because why? You need the money, right? You need, because that's what, funding is tied to, is the number of students that you have in your building. So the pro school advocate is stuck in this catch-22 of, our hands are tied because we've got so many students. We've got overcrowding in the classroom. Our buildings aren't up to date to be able to handle the numbers or the types of students that enter in there. But at the same time, they want to scream foul when other schools aren't handcuffed with the same things and are able to produce better results. And instead of applauding that and wanting to build off of that, what do? They absolutely demonize charter schools. They absolutely demonize homeschoolers. They demonize private schools. They demonize anybody who would dare to challenge the monopoly that schools have on educating children or attempting to educate children. And so this idea of reform is really just futile. It's a complete waste of money. And I would encourage anyone listening to go back and look at some of the writing that I've done specifically at FEE. I chronicle in part 2 of an article series that Mike and I co-wrote what the numbers look like in terms of what's been spent on education going back to the Lyndon Johnson administration, where he signed the first secondary school act, public school act. And then obviously with the advent of the Department of Education with Nixon, the dollars have just been astronomical. And when you look at the rate of return in terms of what we're getting, and I know public education teachers don't like to do this, they don't like to talk about rate of return or return on investment in terms of what you're spending with tax dollars and what you're getting back. They will be real quick to point out, the valedictorians, the people that are doing this, the people that are doing that, but quietly sweep under the rug the hundreds of thousands of kids that are let down and where school fails them. Okay. And so I think that's a really important thing. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about here before we transition into the Gingrich article from Fox News is something else that I talked about in my speech, just briefly. I didn't spend a whole lot of time with it, but it spurred me on to come home and write my next article for FEE. And so I just submitted that over this weekend. I don't know, A, if it'll even be accepted, or B, what the timeline on that will be to publication. But if it does get accepted and it is published, I will be sure to provide links on all of my social media for that so you can see it. But it's on this idea of something called educational neuroscience, which is a concept that many schools, at least around Central Indiana, I cannot speak to other states. I know it is something that is obviously known of and available nationwide. But here, at least in Central Indiana, we're seeing a surge in school districts that are using this platform known as educational neuroscience. And so, I explained in the article what educational neuroscience is. Kind of the Cliff Notes version, very, very quickly, is it's essentially a concoction and a mix of different psychological studies, whether it's brain development, cognitive development, emotional development. It's really just a way to kind of understand how kids develop. But more importantly, and what the emphasis and stress has been on, at least in the school district that I work in, has been on understanding the trauma that children can go through and the emotional baggage that they bring to school. So the very unique perspective that's been presented to us is, and this has been presented to us via data that's been collected in the county that I teach in, is, look, we've got a lot of students who have really crummy home lives. And that could mean that, a parent has been removed, they've been incarcerated, they are, actively using drugs, they're abusive, both mentally and physically or sexually, whatever it might be. The picture that's being painted for us is that there's a significant portion. I don't know what that is. Could it total up to be about a quarter? I don't know. And I would say, if my numbers are correct, we have about 550 students at 9 through 12 in the building that I work in, that we've got a sizable chunk of students that have really, really difficult home lives. And so what does that mean then? Why are we employing educational neuroscience? Well, the way that it's being packaged and sold is, well, we need to help these kids overcome that adversity, learn how to deal with it, help them rewire their brains, help develop what has been told to us as family privilege. And that right there is the jumping point off that I want to look at as to why I see educational neuroscience as a potential danger and something that we have to be very, very careful of in terms of how it's employed through schools. Because if you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, dude, what is your problem? That doesn't sound like anything evil or sinister or wrong. If you're helping a kid overcome adversity and they've got a really bad home life and they're with you a lot during the day, Monday through Friday, what's the problem here? Why are you ranting on about this? Well, again, I think there are some well-intentioned sides to this. But again, as I said, what we have to do is be very careful. And there are two things in particular, again, and I lay this out in the article, that we have to really think about. Number one is having the ability to rewire the brain, the neuropaths that we develop when we have experiences with people. There's a lot of different things that go on that can help, us to rewire the way that our brain functions and operates, right? Kind of that fight or flight response that we get. Does the brain say, am I safe? Okay, then I can function in a normal state versus I'm on a heightened sense because I feel like I'm in danger, so on and so forth. Again, not necessarily a negative thing to understand or teach, but again, we've got to be very careful, because if I admit that I have the power to do that as a teacher, what else can I use my power of rewiring a student's brain, especially, right, an elementary student who is very impressionable? If I come in teaching a certain ideology, if I come in preaching a certain worldview or perspective, whoa, that's a really big deal right there, okay? And as a father of a child who's 11 and 8, I would have some serious reservations about giving essentially a stranger the authority to be able to do this, right? And so I think we got to be very careful with how this is viewed in that regard. And then what I have the bigger complaint about here with this is the idea of this sense of a family privilege, right? That essentially what we're admitting here is that we are looking at potentially, okay, maybe replace is too harsh of a word, but maybe it isn't, right? Replace the family, the nuclear core family here, because what we're admitting is that core nuclear family sucks. It's bad. It's awful. It's harming you. And so, what you need is somebody who will love you and care for you, listen to what you have to say, take the time to hear you out. Essentially play psychologist, right? Just lay down on the couch and let's talk it out. First off, I'm not trained to do that. That's not my job. That's not my duty. Now, I don't want to come across as cold-hearted or callous. If a student comes to me, and I would challenge anybody to ask anyone who's ever had me as a teacher, I am more than willing to listen to anybody at any time, so long as I have the time to do it. I've never shut anybody down from coming and talking to me about anything that's going on in their life, whether it's, relationship problems with a boyfriend or girlfriend, or, work problems, problems with other teachers, home, whatever. I'll listen, right? I don't mind doing that at all. But again, coupled with the idea that we have to embrace them and give them this sense of family privilege. To me, that's taking it too far, right? That's going beyond my duty and responsibility as an educator, right? And so again, I think we have to be very careful, because as I say in my article, who is to say that a couple of years down the road, teachers aren't all of a sudden, as they're exposed to more and more of what these kids are bringing in from home, aren't going to be given the authority to be able to make the call on a student being removed from a home. That we already have to make by law calls to DCS if we acknowledge or even faintly believe that there is any kind of abuse going on. Now, again, I'm not necessarily against that, right? But if we are taking this to the degree that it could potentially go to, it could be very feasible that a teacher would have the ability and authority to at least play a part in, or a role in, if they hear things or interpret things that students are saying to them, that could lead to them being ripped from their home and removed. And I'm not comfortable with that, right? Now you might be thinking, yeah, in clear cut slam dunk cases of physical, mental, sexual abuse, sure, that's a situation that needs to be taken care of. But I get a lot of kids, my mom and dad are mean. My mom and dad made me do this. My mom and dad yelled at me. Okay, well, is that emotional abuse? There's all kinds of questions about, should parents be able to spank their child? If a kid comes into me and says, I got my butt whipped last night because I smarted off to my mom and dad, do I have to report that as abuse? Do I have the authority and ability to be able to make that determination there? So again, I think that's a very dangerous, slippery slope that we're setting up here by employing this in our schools. Again, it's much like every reform effort in school. It's well-intentioned, but as you know, if you've studied any kind of reform, there's the law of unintended consequences, right? Look at, for example, the debate that we're having with gun control. We've made all these gun-free zones, right? And so what has happened? People have become sitting ducks. When you look at a majority of mass shootings and tragedies, many of them happen in gun-free zones, because the person committing the atrocities is right in their mind enough to say, hey, there's a high likelihood that nobody's going to have a weapon to be able to stop me. Right. And so, again, that is kind of the same thing here. This attempt to reform by having the educator take a more active role in engaging in what is going on outside of the walls of schools is a very dangerous thing, in my opinion, and something that probably most parents aren't familiar with and don't know is going on. I don't know how well we have communicated this to our community. And again, in a way that it would be thought of like this, right? If it's been presented as like in flowery language, and look at the great work we're doing and so on and so forth, to try to spin a PR situation. But again, at the end of the day, we have to think these things out logically, right? We've got to stop and not stop at the surface level, but dig a little bit deeper and think a little bit more about this to its logical end. And so, just to kind of wrap up, this same idea is being presented in this book, Class Warfare, that I was talking about a minute ago, where there's a leadership at a charter school where somebody comes in and does kind of a case study, right? They're walking through the school for the day, and they notice how harsh the rules are in the building, and the guy doing the walkthrough makes a comment to the school leadership about, man, don't you think this is a little too much for these kids? And the lady running the school comes back and says, I have kids too, and I think maybe you need to cut them a little bit of slack. And the lady says, your kids have you. These kids don't. They need a lot more from a school than your kids do. And that's the implication there, that schools are to play the parent when there isn't one at the home. And that is absolutely a very dangerous and sinister part behind what is going on here. Schools are not parental groups. They're not community parenting. We shouldn't be using the old adage, it takes a village, or anything like that. I want to raise my kids the way that I best see fit, and I don't want a group of strangers, as trusted as they may be as educators, no matter what background checks or schooling or certifications they have. At the end of the day, they are teachers. They are associates. They're people that my kids know. They're people that they can trust in certain ways, but not to the level of trusting them to be a part of raising them as a human, okay, in terms of instilling values and morals and things of that nature. I don't think that is the job of the school to do, okay? So again, that's kind of what I wanted to touch upon in relation to that. It's a good way to kind of introduce, hopefully, the article that will be published later on this week. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time for me to hear on that. So like I said, once I know that article has been given the green light and will be run, I'll be sure to get that out on all of my social media accounts. All right. So in the last remaining moments that we have here in the program today, I want to shift gears to a political issue that is going on today, and talk a little bit about this, because this relates a lot back to what I've just been teaching in my government class this past week. We've been going through the foundations of government, and in my class, my U.S. government class for seniors, we go through some very surface level stuff on the Enlightenment. We talk about foundational documents that influenced the founding fathers. And then we get into kind of talking about the principles of sovereignty and legitimacy and consent of the governed and will of the people and things of that nature. And I really try to encourage my students to rationally think about these things and not just gloss over them, not just to mention them as, phrases in a document, but to really stop and think about, how does a government know when it has the consent of the people? How do we reconcile living in a society where if there is a public policy issue up for debate and, public tendencies show 55-45, and we go with the majority, that's 45% of your population that you're disregarding, right? And so we talk about tyranny of the majority and minority protections, and we really try to dive into a lot of this stuff to get the kids thinking beyond just, hey, here's the Declaration, here's the Articles of Confederation, here's the Constitution, and move on. I want them rationally thinking about these things, because what I do for the rest of the trimester is going to be predicated on what they think about those things, right? And again, I want to be very clear. I don't tell them what to think, okay? I don't tell them that they have to view things a certain way. I introduce a lot of questions to try to get them to think about them, but I let them arrive at their own conclusions on these things. And so one of the big concepts that we talked about last week was sovereignty and legitimacy. And how do we know when a government is, quote unquote, illegitimate, right? Meaning that they've lost the confidence vote from its people, and there's time for a new government to come in, right? When, again, that can happen in a number of different ways. One of the ways in which we see this currently going on is over in Hong Kong. So if you haven't been following much of what's been going on over in Hong Kong or know the background story on it, I don't necessarily want to get into a lot of it here right now because I've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that I get through this article from Fox News. But you may want to just kind of look into the history of Hong Kong as a independent province for a very long period of time. Matter of fact, up until 1997, when it was regained control by China, and that's really what's precipitating a lot of the issues over there right now. And I believe from what I've read, this kind of started over the issue of extradition of prisoners back to mainland China from Hong Kong. The citizens of Hong Kong put up a fight over that. And so now the Chinese government and the citizens of Hong Kong have been pitted against each other. And as you can imagine, this has developed into, the world watching what's going on. And it's also been kind of framed as the protesters being pro-democracy, free market, and then obviously the Chinese government as, the communist, socialist, autocrat dictatorship cracking down on any of these freedoms. And there's been a lot of clashes in the streets and in public places in Hong Kong. And so that is kind of a little bit of the background on what's been going on, but you can certainly read more about that if you desire to learn a little bit more. What I want to focus on here is kind of the response that we've seen, because I've tried to look around to kind of see, engage, and I know President Trump has issued some comments on this. I heard one little snippet from him that was so convoluted. It was so second grade level thinking. It was, I hope everything turns out well for Hong Kong. I hope everything turns out well for China. I hope everyone's happy. It's like, what are you talking about? What are you watching? You're just a bunch of dribbling. You have no idea. You don't want to offend anybody. You don't want to take a stand. You're already in this weird position with tariffs. Anyway, I'll get off on a rant on that if I don't stop. So, but what has kind of been the reaction? And I came across this article earlier today, as a matter of fact, from Newt Gingrich, who is somebody that I used to respect. I used to have a lot of respect for Newt Gingrich. I really admired what he was able to do. I think it was back in '94 where they flipped the House, with Clinton and got it into Republican hands, and worked with the Clinton White House. And, as a former neocon myself, somebody that, he was definitely someone that I've read his works and kind of watched him along the way. But I've lost a lot of respect for him over recent years. He's written a number of things that are just, asinine in my opinion. And this is right in line with that. So this title, Newt Gingrich, U.S. must stand with people of Hong Kong fighting for freedom, which again, when I read that title, what immediately comes to mind is, okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to ask the question, what is our role in this, right? Do we have a role in this? Should the United States have a vested interest in actively being engaged with standing, whatever that means, right? Standing. Does that mean that you're vocally supporting them? Does that mean that we're going to give aid to them? Does that mean that we're going to issue threats to China if they don't ease up? What does that even mean, right? So that's the first thing that I would encourage you to do is when you see pieces like this, don't just gloss over the title and just move on in and look for validation, argument points, or anything like that. But go through the process of thinking it through. So again, that's kind of what I thought of. First off, what does he mean by stand? Second off, what is our role in this? Do we have a role in it? Okay. And so I want to go through, I'm not going to read all of this word for word, but I do want to read through a couple of passages here that I think are really important. And right off the bat, I think, when you read through this, I always might come across as a little cynical in terms of how I read things. I try to be skeptical a little bit because I think that's part of the process of questioning things is to kind of keep that bent in your mind. Otherwise, like I said, if you're just looking for validation, what's the point of even reading this? You already know it's from Fox News. You know Gingrich. You know what he's going to say. If you want to do the whole USA, rah, rah, go get them, fine, whatever. Okay, you're not going to get anything out of reading this article. Likewise, if you're on the complete other side of the spectrum, you're just going to be so raving upset and angry, you're just not even going to be able to read a couple of sentences through this before you close the link and shut it down. So again, when you're going through an exercise of reading through media reports or watching videos, try to go at it with, okay, what are some questions that I have as I read through this? Or what are some statements or deductive reasoning that I can get out of doing this? So he starts off by saying, over the past 2 months, the world has seen the people of Hong Kong bravely stand up to the growing threat of totalitarianism. So I'm going to stop right there. Okay. That is maybe absolutely true. But again, go back to what is the point of this article? The point is that the U.S. must stand against this. Okay. So my opinion or commentary on this is, if we're going to really start mingling in other people's business, shouldn't we tend to our nest first, right? What about growing threats of totalitarianism in the United States? Well, that can't be, right? No, there's way. Well, yeah, there is way, right? There's tons of surveillance issues going on. We've got police states, basically being set up in every major city across the United States. I heard a report last week after a motorcycle backfired in Times Square and people went scampering everywhere. And the lady giving the report from Times Square was like, oh, yeah, well, there were police officers everywhere on tops of roofs, armored vehicles, on and on and on. I'm sitting here going like, how is that freedom and liberty living under that kind of an environment, right? So if we're going to really kind of get in the business of, helping those that are living under totalitarianism, shouldn't we be thinking about how we can first promote the most free, liberty-minded government that we can here in the United States before we go meddling in other people's businesses? Okay. What began as a protest against a bill that would allow prisoners to be extradited to mainland China has evolved into a movement to demand that Hong Kong government, largely now controlled by China's Communist Party, adhere to the promises of freedom and autonomy it made when Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997. Protesters have flooded the streets since June, despite the threat of being arrested, smothered with tear gas, pelted with rubber bullets, or attacked by masked thugs with batons. While Chinese tanks have lined up along the border of Hong Kong and mainland China, protesters have waved the American flag and sung the American national anthem. Well, I'm sure Newt takes great pride and privilege in knowing that at least somebody in this world is willing to stand up and salute the American flag and sing the national anthem with pride. The protesters show no signs of wavering, and the outcome remains in doubt. But one thing is certain: the United States and the free world are watching. Is that a threat? Right? What is that even supposed to mean? Chinese leaders must know there will be consequences if the freedoms promised to the people of Hong Kong are eradicated by a communist dictatorship. Stop the presses here. This is just dripping with us versus them. We are the liberty-loving, freedom-loving people, and you got the evil communist dictatorship. This could have been written as 1955 Cold War propaganda. And that's all this is a propaganda piece. Chinese leaders must know there will be consequences. What are those consequences going to be, Newt? What are we going to do? Are we going to go bomb them back into the Stone Age like we've done the Middle East? Are we going to go over there and give them some good old red, white, and blue freedom like we've done in all other parts of the world where we've created chaos and confusion? What is that consequence going to be, Newt? You're already losing a trade battle. You're already getting your lunch eaten by these Chinese communists in terms of how your president is handling this trade war. He's already admitted he's got to back off of it because it may impact the consumers. You think? Why don't you try opening up an economics book and reading basic supply and demand and trade, and then come back to the table and let's look at what we can do once again here in the United States before we start lecturing the other parts of the world about how they ought to carry on about their business. This is more than a protest about proposed new law. It's about protecting the people of Hong Kong from tyranny and despotism. Boy, howdy, have we heard this before, right? Same talking points, same recycled talking points that these neocon clowns have been using since the 1980s, when we had to overthrow dictators down in South America, when we meddled in the Iran-Contra affair. It's the same recycled talking points that we heard in the 90s when we had to go take out Saddam Hussein, and we failed in that regard. And what did we do? We created a mess. And what did we have to do? We had to go back over there and try to clean that mess up. And what has it created? Even more of a mess. So, Newt, I think our record on meddling in other people's affairs isn't a very good one. And I don't think you have a really solid leg to stand on here to lecture the world about how we have to take a role in watching over Hong Kong and